Okay, I'm Dale Rand, the Executive Director of the Lime Association, and want to welcome everybody to our Lime Time in Texas podcast series. We have a special guest today. We have Tom Scullion here from TTI. He's one of the researchers that has been doing work in Texas for at least 30 years, I know, Tom, because I've been around that long, and so
make it 40
years. So Tom is I've probably seen more good pavements and more bad pavements in the state of Texas than anybody that I know. Probably done more forensic studies than anybody I know, and actually been out on these projects. So I came up with a list of some questions for you, Tom. I want to just kind of jump into that and get your thoughts on some of these topics that we have. So I'll just start into question one, and you answer however you feel appropriate. So, okay, the first one I want to say, just based on your work with the FWD and pavement design, what kind of modulus increase do you see typically when we're doing a lime stabilization of clay soils? So I know we're talking about a
Yeah. In Texas, we use a design procedure called FPS 21, where we have to put the strength of the layers in there. Now, we get the strength of the layers by doing deflection testing with this falling weight deflectometer. Problematic soils in Texas have usually got moduli values from 6 KSI to say 12 KSI. When we do the lime treatments, we'll see a 10 times increase in the modulus value. So as far as design is concerned, we're pretty conservative. And so TxDOT, if you're sitting on a soil with 6 KSI and you lime stabilize it, TxDOT allows you to use 35 KSI in the design process. But it also, because you're giving good support to the pavement, will allow you to put in a higher number for your base layer. So there really is some structural benefits for doing a well-stabilized, well-stabilized lime layer. Yeah.
Okay. And yet you mentioned, I think we all know that the clay is the bad acting soils that we have in Texas are the clay soil. So as far as your experience with other alternatives, we know what lime does. Do you get that same kind of modulus increase if you use, for example, I know there's a lot of liquid stabilizer things that are out there now, or GeoGrid. Yeah. Any comments on where you see that same kind of increase, or do you see any increase?
I think the non-standard stabilizers, I think they are around, and I really do not recommend them. I think what you have to do is get soils from a project, take them into the lab, and do some wet, dry strength testing on them before you get. There's many people out there claiming they've got very good non-standard stabilizers, but my recommendation to folks is don't use them until you take them into the lab with soils from that project and get some good wet, dry strength readings on them, because I think there's too many out there. So as far as other applications, I think the geogrids, there's some very successful use of geogrids. Now, as far as geogrids replacing lime, I'm not a fan of that idea. I need to get some proof. I need to see some data to show me that the geogrid is actually, giving us the strength. What I've been requesting, and I haven't got any, is show me some falling weight data, which shows the benefits of putting the geogrid in there rather than the lime stabilized layer. So there's places for geogrids, but as far as replacing lime, I haven't seen evidence that it's a good idea.
Okay. I think your comment you made about the liquid stabilizers, I think in particular goes back to my days at TxDOT. The one test was worth 1,000 expert opinions. I think that always, for us lab guys, that always comes back to that. Just run the test and see what it shows you.
The test has to do as dry strength and a moisture condition strength. When we test these things in the lab, putting water on the treated soil is really the key. Because, man, these things have got to stand up when they get wet. And that's where the problems we've seen. Yeah.
Okay. All right. A couple other questions. I said, kind of from your history of doing forensics on premature pavement failures, what are some of the most common problems that you see? I mean, we learn a lot from forensic studies. And
I think, one of the problems is people don't follow the rules. I think TxDOT has got some excellent rules for taking stuff into the lab and figuring out if we need to use lime or cement. run the tests. And I think they're cutting corners and really not running the tests that they should be running. That's one of the issues, you know. And people sometimes get confused between what am I doing here? Is it a permanent foundation I want? Or am I just, you know, using that temporary working platform stuff? I think if you're just doing the working platform, you know, you may have issues coming back 2 or 3 years later because, you know, it was never designed adequately enough for a permanent foundation. The other thing I think is a problem, particularly when we look at concrete pavements, is I think we don't do enough looking at how well is the stabilization being done. Is it uniform all the way along? I think we don't do enough testing to make sure we've got a uniform foundation. I've seen issues with failed areas where we go and the lime layer is not there, but over here it's there a lot. So I think there was really uniformity problems of how they spread the cement or the lime or what have you.
Yeah.
We need to do a better job of getting more uniformity in construction.
Okay. So I think the problem I've seen also is that sometimes we seem like don't do the design properly, or sometimes we do the design properly and then go change order it in the field.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem we've seen more recently, is that there's a lot of pressure to get fast. I know particularly with lime, people say, well, we don't have time for the curing. We're going to do something faster, cheaper, quicker. And so if you run into that kind of issues.
That's why my business is booming. You know, to show us, you know. I mean, I want to be able to come back 5 years later and I've still got a perfect land. And unfortunately, when we cut corners, it doesn't happen that way.
Yeah. I guess I want to get your opinion on whether or not soil stabilization, you mentioned concrete pavement, whether soil stabilization is needed underneath concrete pavements. I mean, traditionally I was taught that concrete pavement would bridge over anything, and I know last year's short course there was a presentation, I think Dr. Moon Wan presented about, you know, the effect of, you know, doing that the subgrade had some control over the life of that concrete pavement. So what's your...
Oh, totally. I think the life of the concrete pavement has nothing to do with the concrete. I think it's to do with what it's sitting on. If you have, you know, if the major problems you see in concrete pavement are great big cracks, roughness, excessive roughness, that's nothing to do with the concrete slab. That's to do with the fact that you don't have a uniform foundation. So I've in the design build projects I've been promoting that before we put the concrete slab there, we really need to get our foundation layer built and tested with a falling weight deflectometer. And that has been adopted on many of the design build projects underway right now.
Yeah.
I really think your concrete pavements will last forever if they're sitting on a permanent uniform foundation. And sometimes that's not the case.
Okay, all right. I think that's just kind of just seems like that's just changed over the 30 years that I've kind of, like I said, I initially always thought, oh, build concrete, it bridges over anything. So
yeah.
you get a lot longer pavement life out of it than if you do the
basically our soils are so variable and so problematic and so moisture susceptible that, man, you know, Texas has just got the worst case scenario with how problematic our soils are.
Okay. The next question I had is, can you share with us what you think of some of the keys to success to building a long life pavement? I know you've kind of done a lot of presentations on long life pavement, so I know you probably more than anybody knows what it takes to make a good pavement, what it takes to make a bad pavement. So.
Yeah. This is, you know, one of the issues we've got. There's many issues in the pavement design process. You've got to understand your materials. You've got to find out where the problem materials are, what's available. And one of the big unknowns that we've got is how much traffic. We have to design these pavements for a fixed amount of traffic. With the growth that's going on in Texas right now, our traffic estimates have usually been pretty bad. We've spent a lot of time in the last few years coming up with new systems, portable weigh and motion systems, to give us better handles on the traffic. Often we've seen failures in some places where we completely underestimated how much traffic would be on the highway. Cases particularly in the Odessa district that got impacted by the energy sector. So understanding the traffic, making sure that the contractor, whoever's building the thing, is getting everything down in a uniform manner, And I think before we put our premium materials on top, which would be our asphalt or our concrete, we need to make sure that our bases are uniform and solid. So these are the things that we need to take into consideration. I think our design procedures are pretty good. It's just, how do we make sure that the inputs that we put into the design procedures are good? And that's where we sometimes struggle.
Okay, good. So I got a couple of more questions for you, and maybe some specific ones on what specific recommendations can you provide us, the lime industry, on what we can do to ensure that the projects with lime are properly designed and specified and built properly. So kind of just advice to us as the lime industry.
I think one of the areas the lime associations and folks can really help here is in training. You've got to remember that there's been such a transition in the last 20 years within agencies like the counties and the cities and the state in particular. There was a time when you go to these districts and what have you, and there's a lot of older folks there that are experienced. They've all gone. They've all retired. So we have a lot of younger people, and there really isn't the training that these folks need to learn the history of what works and what doesn't work. So that would be number one for you folks to consider.
On some of the construction projects involving lime, we sometimes see change orders. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, where they're taking out the lime or recommending select field sometimes, and sometimes there's reasons for it. For example, there's high sulfates that may justify something like that. But any recommendations on that? You kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I know we seem to be seeing that more often now to where.
The recommendation would be tread carefully on that stuff. We've seen some real failures where you don't underestimate what lime does. You get a permanent change in that soil. You go from these nasty clays to stuff that really looks like a sandy, well-compacted material. You're really changing the deflection and the support giving to all the other layers. Now, if you think you can take the lime layer out and put a select fill material in there, you have to be real careful. My recommendation would be, if someone's considering that, would be to build a test section. Don't go and put 8 miles project down. Do a half-mile project and make sure you've got a uniform, pavement structure that you think. You know how you design this thing, and you know the characteristics. Do a test section if you're making changes, but just tread very carefully. And I think if you don't have the strength you need, you're going to have to change your pavement design. You're going to have to make some of the layers above it thicker.
So when you talk about doing the testing, you're talking about doing like FWD testing on that
somehow certifying
the small test section to make sure that you've got an equivalent.
You design this thing somehow, and now you want to change it. Well, how do you know what you want to change it to is going to give you the same as what you originally designed?
Okay.
So that would be part of it. I think if we're talking to the issues like one of the things they get squared on is the fact that maybe they have sulfates and they've just discovered kind of sulfates. Well, I've been on some projects that were very successful, one in Fort Worth in particular, where the contractor knew we had the problem, so he went ahead and mapped out the areas of sulfates, and he decided, well, what we're going to do. And what he found is the sulfates were in about a 500-foot length in a big project. Mm-hmm. So he didn't take the lime out completely. He took that 500 foot and just replaced the soil in that zone there. Then he came in and successfully lime stabilized that section. Mm-hmm. So anyway, you need people to be aware of what's available, the tools for mapping these things out, and to sit down and make a decision like that. That's a design build section in the Fort Worth district, which is 10 years old now and doing very, 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 very good.
Okay. Because I think we see sometimes where they just come in and say, well, you just got to meet a certain PI requirement to do it, mm-hmm. to change order it. And sometimes that, where you may or may not get the same strength out of it. But you mentioned earlier about doing the test section and measuring the strength just to make sure that you're getting some suitable strength to hold up the pavement. Yeah. That's a good investment, a long-term investment. So. Got another question. So I know back in the old days, it was always 6 inches of lime, mm-hmm. 6% lime. That was, starting, and I think some of that was limitation to the equipment and all of that back then. Now we see sometimes 8 inches, 12 inches. How does that affect the overall pavement design, and what are your recommendations on, what do you look at when you're doing a pavement design to decide, hey, I'm going to put 12 inches or 6 inches or what's next?
I'm not really sure what makes the call on that. I think, you know, if I had to give an example of somebody that's doing this correctly, it would be the Fort Worth district. They've been doing lime stabilization forever, and their lab was very active at the beginning of the whole process. They used to do 6-inch lime stabilized layer, and what they've concluded from looking at performance, they think for a routine section, they get better performance from an 8-inch layer. But what they also found is when you get to some very, very severe soils, now we're talking with soils that have got plasticity indexes in the 40s, they then increase the thickness of the lime layer to 16 inches. All of this stuff is based on somebody finding out what happened and doing some long-term performance studies. And I like what Fort Worth did. You know, they say, man, we're going to jump to 8 inches on everything, except when we're in very problematic soils, then we'll double that. It works. It seems to work very well.
When they do the 16 inches, is that 2 8-inch lifts, or do they try to do that all one? That kind of reaches the limitations of the equipment, doesn't it?
The equipment is better now and better now, but when they started this in the 80s and 90s, I think they just did the 2 lifts.
Okay. Great. I think that's all the questions I had. Tom, you got any other advice you want to give us before we wrap up? I mean, I said, well, we've got you. I said, Tom's the guy that I've relied on my whole career, I think. When I was with TxDOT 26 years, and every time I had a problem, usually with flexible pavement, it says Tom was always the guy to call. So I have a very high opinion of Tom's.
Who are you going to call? Pavement busters.
Yeah. This is the pavement buster guy here. Well, I want to thank Tom for his time today, and appreciate you, talking a little bit about this and kind of educate us a little bit about how to build good pavement. So
it's always a pleasure working with you now.
Right. Thanks, Tom. Thank you for watching this episode of our podcast. If you want to learn more about the use of lime, reach out to us on our website at limetexas.org. You can also email me at dalerand@limetexas.org. And please follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.